Bell Huey is a name you might not know, but the shape and especially the sound of this helicopter you definitely recognize, because the Huey is almost a pop icon, having been featured so much in magazines, on television, and in movies. The Huey went down in history as a revolutionary aircraft that truly enabled the implementation of military air mobility, as well as for the extreme simplicity and robustness of its design, which brought back thousands of soldiers who, if they had been on other helicopters, would certainly have died in combat. Since the beginning of aviation history, there have been few aircraft that have become symbols of their era or their niche. For example, when we think of the Pacific Theater in World War II, we immediately remember the agile Japanese Zero. If we think of bombers, flying fortresses over the skies of Europe quickly come to mind. And if we think of helicopters, it's very likely that a specific model pops into your head, the Bell Utility Helicopter, one Huey. But the story of the world's most famous helicopter began long before the battles in the jungles of Vietnam. In fact, it started being conceived back during the Korean War. At that time, helicopters with more archaic designs were already in operation, mostly for medical evacuation or personnel transport. In 1952, the United States Army began planning how it would use helicopters in future conflicts. The idea was to create 12 helicopter battalions, which would be formed in the future once the right aircraft was developed. And it was during this period of developing the helicopter force that the term air mobility was created. This term means having the ability to transport troops and supplies into and out of the battlefield using aircraft. In addition to carrying out transportation, the idea of building an attack helicopter to protect the troops on the ground, and while they were boarding, was also considered. This aircraft could also function as a kind of weapons platform, providing support for the Allied advance, since it would be easier to use this vehicle than to wait for support from a fixed-wing aircraft. The concept of a large helicopter force had never been put into operation in history. The English and the French had already carried out several military operations involving helicopters with some armed models, but with a limited number of aircraft. One of the greatest minds who helped conceive air mobility was Major General James Gavin, former commander of the 82nd Airborne Division in World War I. He compared the use of helicopters to the employment of cavalry in ancient times, when mounted troops were the elite of the military force. In addition, the cavalry had two characteristics that set it apart from other types of troops: agility and speed, exactly what was sought in the use of helicopters. Even though at the time the technology had not reached the desired level, the United States Army made an effort to apply the concept of agility with a focus on air mobility. An H-19 and H-34 helicopter company was assembled, and after almost a year of testing, the doctrine that would be used with these vehicles in combat began to be developed. The manual titled Army Transport Aviation Combat Operations showed some of the basic techniques to be employed. In 1956, the head of the Combat Development Department of the Army Aviation School, Colonel J. Vanderpool, began testing with available helicopters such as the H-19, H-34, and H-21, with modifications to carry weapons like machine guns, cannons, rockets, and missiles. Meanwhile, with the lessons learned in the Korean War, the defense industry was also adapting to changes on the battlefield. And with aircraft, it was no different. Among the major manufacturers, one paid special attention to the new needs that allowed helicopters to become more effective. His name was Lawrence Dale Bell. Lawrence founded the Bell Aircraft Company in 1935, a few years before World War II, producing fixed-wing aircraft. But even in the early 1940s, he was already starting tests with rotary-wing aircraft, helicopters. The company's first prototype of this type flew in 1943, called the Bell Model 30. After visiting the Korean Theater of Operations in 1953, Lawrence Bell said Korea advanced the development of helicopters by at least 10 years. The company's specialized helicopter division had been founded 2 years earlier and was already producing the H-13 Sioux, a small vehicle that is one of the symbols of the Korean conflict. The lessons learned led to subsequent and more advanced models, which use piston engines. But a huge leap occurred when gas turbines were developed. The equipment was developed by the Lycoming Company under the leadership of engineer Aslan Franz. Franz was part of the German team that developed the Junkers Jumo 400 4-engine the jet that powered the Messerschmitt Me 262 fighter and that had arrived in the United States through Operation Paperclip. Initially, the gas turbine would be used in a reconnaissance aircraft, but it was soon adapted for helicopters. In short, the equipment, although more expensive than a piston engine, had a much higher power-to-weight ratio, which in a way made up for its costs. The gas turbine could also be mounted horizontally above the fuselage, which saved internal space. In addition, the transmission mechanisms are simplified, resulting in less maintenance. On February 23, 1955, the American Army awarded Bell Aircraft Company a contract to develop a new utility helicopter. The main focus of the aircraft was to be aeromedical evacuation from the battlefield, with secondary capabilities for general transport and instrument flight training. The helicopter was required to carry up to 3,600 kilograms of payload, have an operational range of 100 nautical miles, and maintain a speed of 185 kilometers per hour. If possible, the aircraft's fuselage should fit inside a C-124 Globemaster II or a C-130 Hercules. Bell's proposal came in the form of Model 204, designated as XH-40 during the testing period in the armed forces. The Model 204 was a single-engine aircraft with a monocoque construction that included magnesium in its fuselage. The engine was a Lycoming XT 53L1, and the aircraft featured a semi-rigid main rotor with a diameter of 13.4 meters made of aluminum components. Crew access was through side doors, similar to those of a car, and the rear doors were sliding. When on the ground, the height of the aircraft floor in relation to the ground was not very high, so loading equipment inside was easy. Up to 8 people could be transported inside. And for aeromedical evacuation, 4 stretchers could be installed by removing the passenger transport seats. The initial tests of the Model 204 in October 1956 showed that the prototype could reach up to 222 kilometers per hour, an operational ceiling of 17,500 feet, and an operational range of 340 kilometers. Its empty weight was 1,700 kilograms, and its maximum loaded weight was 2.5 tons, far from ideal. 3 prototypes were built using 700 horsepower engines, but soon after, 6 units were produced with engines delivering 770 horsepower. These subsequent prototypes, the YH-40, also featured changes in the number of engine cooling panels and some modifications to the fuselage near the rotor. The turbine air intake was reworked and the elevators were repositioned a little further forward compared to the initial prototype. These changes were the result of exhaustive tests which were only completed in 1957, almost a year before the delivery of the final pre-production models in August of 1958. When it entered service with the Army, the aircraft was designated Utility Helicopter 1 in 1962. The Army's tradition was to name each helicopter model after a Native American tribe. And so the Utility Helicopter 1 ended up being named Iroquois. But the name was difficult, and everyone pronounced it differently. On the other hand, the crews and ground personnel started calling the utility helicopter one Huey. The name was inspired by a famous cartoon of the time featuring a big, fat baby duck called Baby Huey. The use of the name became so widespread that Bell itself joined in and started releasing all helicopters from the factory, with Bell stamped on the left pedal and Huey stamped on the right pedal. In total, 9 prototypes were built for evaluation and testing, followed by 9 production UH-1 helicopters. The price of all the vehicles was considered low, at about $28.7 million US dollars, with the amount including the cost of the engines. Production of the first Huey model, the UH-1A, began in 1959. The delivery of the first 173 Hueys took place over the following 2 years. Ending in 1961, the development of the next variant of the Huey, the utility helicopter, 1B, took place at the same time as the first models of the A series were being built. Also in 1960, the first example of the type was tested with better engine power, a higher rotor mast, and other modifications. These changes were very important because they made it possible, for example, to increase the available internal space by 50%. And the aircraft's loaded weight became 3,850 kilograms. Changes in the construction of components made the Huey more resistant, flexible, and reliable. These are characteristics that marked its history in the armed forces of several countries. Most of the Hueys of models A and B were assigned for training new crews, since the Army was eager to integrate the aircraft into its newly developed concept of air mobility. Several incentive programs were created to train a large number of crew members. Initially, many were skeptical of the Huey due to the mediocre performance of the A model, but with the arrival of the B models, the Iroquois soon earned the nickname Cadillac of helicopters from some crews. In 1962, the first units of the Huey, the A model, were sent to the conflict that would make it famous, the Vietnam War. The South Vietnamese forces initially only had older helicopters, such as the H-9, H-21, H-34, and H-37, which suffered heavy losses in combat against North Vietnam, especially during the incursion made by communist forces between the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Hueys that initially arrived in the country were intended for aeromedical evacuation, but months later, the first armed units arrived to test their effectiveness in combat. They were also A models and belonged to the Tactical Transport Utility Helicopter Company. Low-caliber machine guns, most commonly the Browning M 2.30, were mounted on their skids at the front, and right behind, 8 80-millimeter rocket launcher tubes. These armed Hueys were initially used to escort cargo helicopter, 21 Shawnee transport helicopters, and until 1963, they had to follow the rule that they could only fire at targets after those targets showed hostile intent. After February 1963, that rule was dropped and the lives of the armed Huey pilots became easier. Over time, the team testing the armed utility helicopter, 1S, received more aircraft, including the B models, with more weapon options. With numerous missions carried out, a doctrine was created for the use of armed escort helicopters. The operations would be divided into 3 phases. The en route phase would be carried out with a helicopter formation flying above 1,500 feet, an altitude where they would be safe from small arms fire. The second phase, the approach, would see the aircraft formation flying as low as possible kilometers before reaching the target. This way, visual or radar detection was greatly reduced. The last phase, the landing, was the most dangerous. For the transport aircraft, this was the moment when they were most vulnerable, since they had to wait for the infantry to disembark safely. Similarly, The escort aircraft would fly extremely low around the landing zone to provide close fire support, as well as to draw the attention of possible enemy forces. The results of this tactic were clear. In 1,779 missions over a period of 5 months, only 11 armed helicopters were hit by enemy fire, resulting in 246 casualties among the Viet Cong guerrillas. Only one UH-1B was severely damaged, with just one other shot down. And with this data, the structure of the helicopter companies to be sent to Vietnam was also defined. One platoon would use armed B models, while the other 2 platoons would be exclusively for transport, also using the same number of 8 B model units. The escort pilots had the complicated task of maintaining a constant distance from the aircraft carrying out the transport. The escorts were heavier, since they carried a lot of weapons and ammunition, so they were slower and less maneuverable. If the escorts got too far away, the Viet Cong guerrillas would take advantage of the opportunity and fiercely attack the transports at the moment of landing. So the development of effective air coordination also emerged as a result of helicopter operations in the region. This helicopter operation also made it clear that there was a need for a more agile and faster model to be more efficient in escorts and in supporting troops on the ground. The need to get the maximum performance out of the B model in the hot and humid environment of Vietnam led to a new modification. The utility helicopter 1C, the B model could carry 165 gallons of fuel. The C model, on the other hand, could carry up to 242. With its new engine, the T-53L11, and changes to the main rotor, the utility helicopter 1C was several times more maneuverable than its predecessor. This difference in performance leap of the utility helicopter 1C led to several units being modified to be armed. Of these C models, some had been adapted to use the Hughes tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, triple-guided missile platform. Only 2 B models had been certified to use these weapons when the North Vietnamese began their offensive in 1962. These 2 unique units together managed to destroy at least 26 enemy armored vehicles. The arrival of even more Hueys in Vietnam and their more powerful versions also allowed for the refinement of escort tactics. The escort leaders would be responsible for engaging the enemies, maintaining constant radio contact with the other helicopters. The firing should always start at the maximum range of the helicopter's weapons, beginning with the machine guns and then following with rocket fire. The coordination among the mission elements was so great that after one aircraft made its pass, another would immediately follow to continue suppressing the enemy. Before the attacks, a briefing was held showing the locations already known to have enemy troops, as well as the approach for the incursion. After the troops landed, there were cases where the infantry commander on the ground would temporarily take command of the operation, marking the position of Allied troops and directing the armed helicopters against enemy concentrations. For the flight and landing, the most common formation was the V formation, with each helicopter keeping a safe distance from the other aircraft so as not to get caught in their turbulence wake. 4 or 5 escorts would arrive at the landing site 1 to 5 minutes earlier to soften up the enemy. And if more aircraft were available, they would fly behind the transport formation to provide even more cover. Ideal conditions such as firm terrain and no enemy resistance allowed a formation of 12 troop transport aircraft to unload all their soldiers in less than 2 minutes. When the terrain was not favorable, the helicopter could hover close to the ground, with the soldiers using the skids for support, and in extreme cases, they could even rappel down from the aircraft. The most famous units to operate the Huey in Vietnam were the air cavalry troops. The armed utility helicopter 1S were part of the Red Team, which, when flying together with reconnaissance units, designated as the White Team, became the Pink Team. The idea was to use reconnaissance, flying at low altitude to find enemies. And when they were detected, the armed Hueys would come down and attack. If they couldn't destroy the target, they would call in the blue team, which were the landing troops, to confirm the damage to the enemy and make sure the mission had been accomplished. The creation of the air cavalry troops was the culmination of the use of an airmobile army that had been planned many years before back in Korea. But the Army was not the only one to use the utility helicopter. The United States Marines also ordered their own version, the utility helicopter 1E, with an initial order of 72 aircraft, which would eventually be increased to 209 units. The story of the Huey with the Marines began in a way that fits perfectly with the corporation. Before buying the aircraft, the Marines borrowed a few units from the Army to test their capabilities. One of these helicopters was prepared for the flight of Colonel Marion Carl, director of the Aviation Corps, at the Patuxent River base. Shortly before the test, unfortunately, a truck backing up hit the helicopter's elevator, destroying the vital control component and any chance of repair. Since there was no time to order a spare part, it was taken from an Army Series A helicopter that was at a nearby base. The problem with all this is that the elevators on the A and B models are different sizes. But even knowing that, Colonel Carl didn't care much and took off, along with Marine Captain David Spurlock, who was a test pilot. The aircraft then headed to Washington, facing rain and dense fog, having to fly low. Besides showing confidence in the aircraft's capability, the flight, which went smoothly, also served to show that the visibility in the Huey's cockpit wasn't as bad as people thought, even in adverse situations. The E model had some special modifications, such as a rotor brake, so it could stop spinning on the busy deck of a tight ship at sea, whether because of a landing or the ocean wind. New radios were also installed, which were compatible with the versions used both on the ground and in more advanced airborne platforms. In addition, many components were made of aluminum. The early models of the Huey had a lot of magnesium, which, even though it was lighter than aluminum, would corrode much more easily with shipboard operations. And soon the Marines had the same request as the Army. They needed an armed version created for them, since at the time there was a huge debate at all levels about the use of helicopters versus fixed-wing aircraft for close air support. The Chief of Naval Operations for the Marines requested only onboard weapons for self-defense, saying that these helicopters carry out observation, reconnaissance, and rescue missions far beyond Allied lines without armed escort. There is currently no defense system against ground fire for these helicopters. The request was made without directly mentioning close air support, which prevented any bureaucratic intervention. The request for the weapons reached Squadron HMX-1, which had just developed a similar kit for another helicopter, the Utility Helicopter 34. Called TK-1, the kit was soon adapted for use on the Huey, being renamed TK-2. The Marines then tested and employed the modification with some variations, using machine guns and rockets. The United States Navy also operated a number of Hueys. The force became responsible for the waterways of the Mekong River Delta, having to deal with any disruptions caused by enemy guerrillas. For this, they initially used only patrol boats and hovercrafts, some of these manufactured by the Bell Company. On some river patrols, the Viet Cong managed to put up fierce resistance, and then the idea of helicopter support for the missions began to take shape. But the Navy had neither the vehicles nor the crews prepared for this, even though it was also involved in the search for the same helicopter as the Marines, the E-Series. To solve the problem of the lack of vehicles, aircraft were requested from the Army, which provided 8 Model B helicopters without the crews. To get around this personnel issue, the Navy had to call in some of its teams that were based in California. These personnel belonged to the 1st Helicopter Support Squadron and were specialized in aircraft carrier operations and search and rescue missions. After weeks of adapting to the aircraft, environment, patrol boat tactics, and weaponry, the Navy pilots and their crews would operate both on vessels and on land. When the Navy finally began operating the armed B models, they were nicknamed Sea Wolves by the Army units. In their first operation, the Sea Wolves went after a group of enemy sampans. Sampans are simple boats from the region used for river transport. When they arrived at the location, the Navy's B models encountered a force of 80 boats transporting an entire Viet Cong battalion. It is estimated that 15 boats were sunk, with huge losses to the enemy force. The country's waterways didn't have much support for air navigation, or even significant terrain to help with orientation. So, the Navy's utility helicopter, 1B pilots would fly their patrol routes 3 to 4 times a day to memorize their areas of operation. Another important detail is that the Sea Wolves had some of the best armed Hueys in the conflict. In addition to the side gunners' weapons, they also used 1 or 2 front machine guns on each side of the fuselage, as well as rocket launcher pods. One of the weak points of the Huey B was the underside and rear of the aircraft. The Viet Cong quickly learned about this detail and would wait for the aircraft to pass before shooting. In response, the Huey gunners developed a technique. As soon as the enemies fired from behind the aircraft, the gunners would lean out of the helicopter, standing on the skids, and fire back with customized M60 machine guns. In addition to all the difficulties of having to land and take off from small boats, which limited their internal fuel and amount of ammunition, the humid environment also took away much of the helicopter's performance. A famous story of one of the Sea Wolves took place in January of 1968. Jack Williamson was a gunner for the Riverine in the Navy, and he was in Vietnam at the time when a ceasefire had been agreed upon for the celebration of Tet, the New Year's holiday of the local calendar. Even so, there was a rumor that the Viet Cong would break the pact and attack under the cover of the celebrations. While he was at one of the Sea Wolves' land bases, Jack saw that an Army helicopter had made an emergency landing nearby. The aircraft was completely damaged, with all kinds of bullet holes. As he approached, he helped pull a wounded gunner out of the helicopter. The pilot looked at him and asked, "Are you a gunner?" Jack said yes. "Then get in," the pilot replied. And that's how Jack realized the rumor was true. That was the day when the Northern forces carried out multiple attacks throughout South Vietnam, and it became known in history as the Tet Offensive. At midnight on the holiday, all hell broke loose. The sight at bases across the country was pure terror, with mortar fire and tracer rounds lighting up the sky, resulting in huge losses on both sides. Since the Army was short on personnel, Jack kept operating with them to try to save the local airfield and nearby bases, witnessing many of his acquaintances die during this period, which was one of the bloodiest of the war. During the fighting, the American military saw the need to further increase the capacity of the B model, starting what can be defined as Phase 2 of Huey's life. The helicopter's fuselage was extended by another 104 centimeters, with the adoption of the T-53 L-11 engine in the first two-thirds of the entire production of the new model, called the Utility Helicopter 1D. The final third of the model's production received a more powerful engine, creating the Utility Helicopter 1H variant, into which many from the Delta series were later converted. The increase in fuselage size allowed the Utility Helicopter 1D to carry a team of 12 fully equipped soldiers and up to 14 men in extreme cases. Its internal space now allowed it to carry 6 stretchers and 3 seats for the medical team or lightly wounded. A relevant detail is that the maximum number of people in the helicopter varied according to nationality, since on average South Vietnamese soldiers were much smaller and lighter than Americans, thus allowing for more passengers. This difference decreased with the arrival of the Huey Delta, which was much more powerful and spacious than its predecessors. The Delta's maximum takeoff weight was 4,300 kilos, and the hook installed on its belly could support up to 2 tons. The main rotor also had an increased diameter, as did the size of the tail. The easiest way to identify the D model, however, is by the number of windows in the cabin, since this model has 2 instead of the single one found in previous models. Another difference is also the onboard weaponry. In the American Army, it was decided that the smaller and lighter ones would serve as weapons platforms, while the larger ones, like the Delta, would be used for troop transport, cargo, and medical evacuation. That's why it was very common for the Delta to have only one M60 machine gun installed on each side of the fuselage, operated by the gunners. But in the armed forces of other countries, the story was quite different. The Royal Australian Air Force equipped their Rio and Delta with 2 fixed M134 miniguns for forward firing, with rocket pods on the sides of the fuselage. The crew had pairs of M60 machine guns installed on each of the doors. The South Vietnamese Air Force also loaded their Delta models with weaponry. At the end of the conflict, the Vietnamese adapted their helicopters to use miniguns instead of M60s on the sides of the vehicle in many units. The last American force to adopt the utility helicopter, one, was the United States Air Force. After years of disputes involving the use of this type of aircraft, Bell Company designed a variant of the Huey that used the General Electric T-58 engine, since the Air Force had large stocks of the equipment. The choice of this engine led to many changes in the basic structure of the Huey, resulting in the utility helicopter, 1F model. The Air Force also operated another model exclusively for psychological warfare, equipped with loudspeakers that played music to boost the morale of its troops, as well as sounds to try to demoralize the enemies. The Huey had dozens of different models built during its 70 years of operation. 59 countries operated the aircraft, which became a symbol of versatility and the ability to operate in any environment on Earth. Brazil was one of its main operators, especially of the H model, which was nicknamed Sapão, or Agazão here. In the Brazilian Air Force, the Sapão was retired from service in 2018, but some public forces, such as the Civil and Military Police of Rio de Janeiro, still use the aircraft. The Military Police of Rio de Janeiro uses the Huey-2, a more modern variant of the aircraft. And the Civil Police uses a Huey-H, which was built back in 1967. This helicopter even operated in Vietnam from 1968 to 1971. With more than 16,500 units produced and used in several countries over the last 7 decades, the utility helicopter, one, has become a reference in aviation history and in popular culture. Considered one of the most versatile aircraft ever built, it also made appearances in movies, such as the legendary Apocalypse Now from 1979. Curiously, the aircraft used in the movie belonged to the Philippine military forces, and every day they had to be repainted for filming because at night they were deployed to attack real rebel militias that were at war in the country. In some cases, aircraft had to take off in the middle of filming to assist in attacks against rebels operating near the film set. What's even crazier is knowing that the movie didn't have direct support from active duty American military forces. And when this news spread throughout the region where the filming was taking place, veterans who had served in Vietnam and had previously been considered missing in action started showing up there. Those men had actually just chosen to live in the Asian region. And since there were no American military consultants present, they volunteered themselves to help with their knowledge, increasing the realism of several scenes. The Huey project was not limited to its own fuselage. Even though adaptations to use weapons on the utility helicopter, one had relative success, something more could be done. And that's how, using many of the Huey's parts and techniques, a new helicopter emerged designed solely for combat. The AH-1 Cobra, another legendary aviation icon that flew over the dense forests of Vietnam. A true innovator of fighter tactics and the first pilot to surpass the Red Baron and reach 100 kills. Now learn the story of the German ace Werner Melders. Discover his tactics, his secrets, and his entire career in this first episode of the series Brillantenträger, the most decorated soldiers of the Third Reich. Become a channel member to access SDG Premium and enjoy. So did you like our content? If you want the War Room to keep producing these videos, consider supporting us. You can help us by sending a Pix or through our campaign on Apoya SC. There, you'll get access to our exclusive WhatsApp group and have your name displayed here in the videos. The link is right here in the description. Well, if you like this video, don't forget to share it with your friends. Also, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here for now and thank you again for watching. Take care. From the War Room.